to start the official part of the interview, this is actually a fun full circle. So I am really enjoying the opportunity today to be on the, other side of this, where I first met Larissa Wild when she was interviewing me for the Art Elevator podcast, which now we co-host, and I was just a guest at that point in time. And so this is really fun because now Patrick and I, we get to interview Larissa, and we're going to be talking about her appraisal company and her specialization in appraising Western art. And so this is, to be on the other side of this is really fun. So welcome, Larissa.
Thank you. It's fun for me too. I feel like I'm playing dress ups here.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, speaking of which, I mean, because you're an appraiser, you're a gallerist, a dealer, and also an artist. Um, so which one came first? Like chronologically, like what were you doing? Which one? How did that all?
Definitely being an artist. Definitely being an artist. So I went to art school in Sydney, Australia. I went to the National Art School, and it was my goal to be a full-time artist at that point, which, I'd love to be now as well. However, I got out of art school and realized, oh, there's more to it than just making the art. And so it was a long journey through moving countries as well, and working in galleries and realizing, oh, you know what, I think a really good addition to to round this whole consulting and gallerist picture out would be to become an appraiser, just to really understand that value side of things. And so in a nutshell, that's the beginning to the end. And we're back here where I'm an appraiser who now wants to also be a full-time artist.
Absolutely. And because so this is something Patrick and I talk about a lot because we are also artists. Something the three of us have in common is that knowing the mediums and from having used them ourselves in creating art, I feel like it adds a whole nother layer to what the perspective we bring to our appraisal practice. Because, we're seeing this incredible watercolor. We know firsthand how hard it is to make the paint do that, or an oil painting. And so I think that that's a really beautiful blend of backgrounds to be an artist and also be an art appraiser, because we notice little details that someone who's never handled those particular artistic mediums might not.
I agree with that. I think it really adds an element to it. And then the specialization in whatever you do as an artist adds, because you've really researched those materials and those topics and what makes a good composition or how to fulfill your intention. So you can translate that to understanding an artist's oeuvre and maybe a C piece from an A piece because you know the struggle.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, the good whole good, better, best kind of thing. I think it's people, who may make their own art kind of, yeah, it's maybe easier to think in those terms, make those judgments. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
It's real. And your background there, I know from all the beautiful pictures you send me all the time that that is pretty much what it looks like where you live. The Rocky Mountains are behind
Oh,
you
wow.
in your business name. And so can you tell us a little bit more about, starting on the other side of the world and then developing this really deep specialization in appraising Western art?
Certainly. And that is Beaver Creek behind me, but I think it's flipped now that I'm looking at it. I think I forgot to put.
I won't know the difference.
Maybe it's
Don't
the
worry.
right way. I have to double check. Anyway, yeah. So I finished art school. I worked in museums and started to chip away at being an artist in Australia. And I decided, because I've always had a love of mountains, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to go and do a season mountain biking actually in Thredbo in Australia, which led to me staying and doing a ski season, which led to me teaching skiing and traveling to different mountain areas in the world, Austria, Japan, and then here in the Vail Valley. And so I landed here as a ski instructor, but with this art background. So I went into working in an art gallery in Beaver Creek that specialized in Western and wildlife as well as sporting art, which is the main genre in these Western parts, and quickly moved on to becoming the director there. And during that time, I learned as an Australian that Western art in America means American Western art. And so I do try to make a point, and maybe it's just being an annoying Australian foreigner, like I always try to say American Western or Western American, because for people who don't know this region, it can be confusing. And there's so many idiosyncrasies, and it's such a specific culture that has been represented and captured through the art here that is, I mean, it's the perspective of living here, the history, if you trace the history of American Western arts, it's the history of living here and the frontier life, but it's very much from an East Coast perspective, a lot of it,
Mm.
and so learning those distinctions of, what was idealized in the West by painters such as Russell and Remington, and what that meant, and what the whole shift to people moving to the West meant in terms of a specific freedom and exploration and adventure. I think just capturing and learning that whole culture that is, it's represented in Hollywood, and most people around the world will have watched certain movies that capture that, and it's not politically correct to say, but cowboy and Indian movies, right? As they were known. I think people, they see that outside, but to really live here and understand the daily lives of a lot of people that grew up here, and the history of the place and the sense of place has really added an element to understanding the art here that I never expected to learn. And I didn't come here for that. I came here for the skiing. So it's been a really interesting segue to understand that history and culture here.
That's great. That's
Some,
great. And I mean, that's one you mentioned like the origins, right, of so-called Western art, right? And my impression as somebody who's not an expert, uh, that it was kind of like, things like let's somebody or like railroad executives or something were like, let's send some artists out there, show them all how great it is out there, or something like that. Maybe that was part of the spirit, and then it became something totally different over time. That's interesting.
Yeah, and there was an element of that, especially, with that whole promotion of trying to get people to move out here from the East Coast specifically. I mean, it happened from the West Coast too, but a lot of that, and there were the posters and all of that sort of aesthetic that were designed as a political type, like piece to encourage settlement out here. But then there were also the artists who just had that passion in their heart and soul for that sense of adventure and discovering and living in a frontier where things were really on the cusp of change. I mean, that's one thing with a lot of these paintings from the era of Russell and Remington was they were borderline picturing things from the past and
Hmm.
glorifying that past, not necessarily just saying, hey, this is how it is out here. There was a sense of nostalgia and an understanding that this is a fleeting moment in time when you can capture the mountain men or the Native American tribes that lived in different areas and that interaction of them all. So I think there was a lot of awareness in the artists that came out here initially that they were capturing a changing world.
I have learned a lot from you on all, it's always, and I'm going to get all the details wrong here because I'm not a specialist in this, but it's always fascinating to me when you're like, oh, the elk is pointed this way, so it's worth more than if the elk is pointed this way. I just made this example up, but these tiny little details like that I'm like, really? The direction of the elk makes a difference? And so in terms of what we do as appraisers, it's about the credibility of our value conclusions. And so just knowing this one detail, it has a different popularity among collectors, that's an objective detail. So I think that's always something that is a great foundation to return to, which you do. And we're both certified members of the International Society of Appraisers, so we have our training in that. But it's the other thing is that I know you speak to this a lot. There is no one monolith in American Western art. There are a lot of different perspectives and voices and periods of time that are, encompassed in that. Like, a topic that Patrick and I find really interesting is contemporary Indigenous art. And so that is, a whole other facet of American Western art that is part of that same broader genre, but coming from a very different perspective.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think like with any niche, there's always that overarching human universal element to it of, what is it that's important to the people who collect it? What is it that they see in it? What is it that is going to add? What are the value characteristics that people who collect that type of work, what's important to them? And so no matter what the topic, those things apply. So I think being a specialist in this region is understanding, well, what are those things that are important, that are value characteristics that people who are going to collect or do collect that kind of work are going to really appreciate and pay for, and pay more for than less for. So I think despite the specificity of the genre, there's those overarching things, and we learn all of those as an appraiser. And I think it is the interesting thing to live in a place and to see, well, how do these things here slot into that methodology and way of looking at art and valuing it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's great. And I saw kind of on this topic, I saw there was that, and I saw you wrote on it too, that the sale from the one of the lesser known Koch brothers, the because I was conscious that people were kind of seeing that as like this barometer for this genre. I mean, do you think that was accurate for that sale, or do you think that was a? I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about it, that one.
Yeah, I think, and it's happened in many genres, especially since 2008 and that whole period of economic issues that occurred there. We saw it with antiques, where only the very best stayed the course and held their value. And I think with this auction that just happened through Christie's, I think that it really does speak to that. Well, there's a lot out there. However, we're distilling down which things are important, and this idea of narrative and understanding within this genre, which at this point in time, because it always shifts what we think is important in the narrative, right? And we, in general, we're rediscovering female artists through history. So, but right now, I think it does speak to the fact that right now people are looking for the highest quality of the story within that genre that they want to relate to, and the story that they feel they want to what would be the word, Sarah? That they feel that they want to endorse.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I mean, something that also happens in times of global and economic uncertainty, they feel more comfortable going for the best because that's a better long-term investment.
Yeah, definitely. Over time, those pieces have been filtered out, and the fact that there are other bigger American Western art collections out there, but that does speak to this idea of somebody that has spent their lifetime curating and looking, and their eye is trusted as one that sees a certain level of quality, which, that's always open to interpretation, but it is like a stamp of approval when someone who's respected in that genre as a collector has put all of that together. And I think that's a really important thing across all genres as well, looking to these collectors who really have formed that. I think I've spoken about it in other topics on our podcast, like that triangle between the artist and the dealer and the collector, understanding that the collector plays just as an important role as the artist and the dealer in basically creating the market that is out there for different genres and artists. And I do think that what was interesting about that sale too, where there were some other artists who weren't household names like Remington, who also were recognized and who broke records in that as well. So I think, like, they call it the flight to value, or what do they call it? The flight to
Oh, the flight to money.
yeah, I think oh gosh, we could go on and on about the whole bandwagon effect and everything like that, but let's not go there.
Yeah, well, and I love that you referenced that model that you came up with. I've always really enjoyed that approach that you have, that the collector is a vital part of this
Mhm.
ecosystem, and they forget that sometimes. And then something I think that's related to that, that's my next question I want to ask you, is you're based out in the Vail Aspen region in Colorado, and there are a lot of pretty high-end collectors in that region, and so a lot of your work is also relevant to family offices and wealth managers who have collectors that they might be working with. And so do you have any tips you want to share of, like when they should reach out to you, or sort of things that they should, be red flags for them that, oh, I need to bring in Larissa to do a review of my client's collection.
Definitely. And I think one thing I would say, if you are a fiduciary that oversees anyone's assets, that it's very important early on to catalog. And that's one service that I offer, is cataloging preemptively before any appraisal insurance is needed. Because when you have multiple properties and around the country, sometimes it can be a sudden need for that estate tax appraisal, or it could just be needed for planning purposes as well. But if you've got everything cataloged, it's going to take a lot of pressure off when the moment comes that you do need that estate to be valued in whole for estate tax purposes. It's something that I think it's very important to be able to have that piece in place ahead of time, because you're at the same time, when you're needing this appraisal, you're managing a lot of other issues at the same time, and the weight of the emotions at that time. So I think taking away one of those clerical items is something I really recommend. Um, and then something that it can be stored, and I do travel interstate as well. I have for multiple homeowners with multiple locations, so that everything can be kind of combined as one in terms of asset management. But yeah, I mean, that would be the biggest preemptive thing that I don't see too many fiduciaries doing, because it's a passion asset, and people don't often look at it as something that needs to be quantified or qualified until it does.
Mhm.
Quickly.
Yeah.
And
Quickly.
it's also a way of taking care of the emotions of the family and the survivors, because we've all seen it's a huge burden wherever someone is in the socioeconomic scale of having to deal with the process of handling someone's estate. And so it's part of the just that psychological caretaking as well. But particularly for the kind of clientele you have, it's actually really, really useful for just estate planning purposes too, to get the data on what is in that collection, because otherwise something might get overlooked that would really make a difference, and they could have made a better choice in how the paperwork is designed.
Definitely, definitely. And it speaks also to, being able to plan for these passion assets to, and it's a hard conversation to have, whether the children or the heirs want the pieces or not. And if not, what's going to be what's going to be the plan. Um, but if it doesn't get taken care of ahead of time, it happens in the moment, and it often happens. It can happen through a liquidation situation, which could have been easily avoided through correct management and deacquisition. It can also just cause issues with, it might not even come down to money, but just having the discussion on what's important to who and how things get divided.
Mhm. Yeah, even like my thinking, even in the case where, say, when you're thinking like estate planning, and there's like heirs, um, who don't want stuff, even in those cases where there's like little interest in this material, like it's the whole idea of, yeah, doing like the cataloging beforehand. It's always going to be like some kind of time and money saver at the very least,
Mm.
especially, when it's like people who don't want to deal with stuff, it's like it'd be so nice to have that in hand, I think, as they're trying to figure out what to do. Yeah.
You don't know the timing of when somebody is going to need that in relation to the tax year.
Mm.
And so, having that in place means that an appraiser, such as myself or you guys, can yeah, you'll come in and you'll re-inspect and do some other things, but having it all cataloged ahead of time means that when that deadline is tighter, that there's less stress.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's when the collector has the opportunity to be involved in sharing provenance information, sharing, the details and the history behind a piece, that's always going to be ideal. There's so many times when I know, all of us, we've walked into a site and it's like, I wish I could talk to the person who owned these things because this would have been really helpful if I
Mm,
could have talked to the person who owned these things. So not only is it hopefully more fun for the collector to be hands-on with this and really having that, it's part of the stewardship of being a collector, I think. And that's something I wish more people thought about it that way, that making, having their pieces be tended in the long term for whatever happens to them, but with their personal information about their role in the life cycle of this painting or sculpture. It's that having that information is always going to be better than not.
Yes, definitely.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I have
Yeah.
so many clients who are children who are like, I wish I had asked about this. I wish my parent had told me about this. And so collectors can also think about it if it's like unpleasant to consider, that it's an act of love to their kids too, to remove that
Mm-hmm.
burden from them.
Yeah, and I think that is a role that if someone is acting as a fiduciary, they really can take that pressure off the client by managing that and coming, directly through us to facilitate a lot of these things.
Yes, yeah. And you have the private client services designation from the ISA like I do. So we have the special training for all of those things. And in addition to American Western art, you're training me now. I'm going to get there. In addition to American Western art, I know that you also praise all kinds of other art, post-war and contemporary art, 20th century art, 19th century art. You have a really broad range that you're competent to appraise. And so in collections where they have American Western art, but also the collector may also be passionate about post-war and contemporary art, you're able to do both. So can you talk a little bit about the rest of your appraisal practice and some of the other items you regularly appraise?
Definitely. I think that especially being in a regional area, to be a specialist in one area, yes, that's the majority of what I see here. However, as you said, there's often people aren't exclusive in their collecting habits. And so I do often find very mixed collections, which coming from a very different background in the art world and having particular interests in other areas means that I am able to speak to and appraise all different genres. And I think it comes back to the topic or the subject that we spoke about before, is like having that understanding and that sort of formula to apply to understanding how to see what's important within a genre, what that what that particular artist or that particular movement was about, how the subject piece might relate in relation to those value characteristics, and then understanding and researching in the correct market. So, specializing in one area does allow you, if you look big picture, to then take that whole system and to apply it to different ones as well. And because I do have a varied interest in different topics as well within the art world, I do enjoy the diversity.
Yeah. And then this just came to me right now. One element that I think is actually really important that you bring to your praising, particularly of American Western art, is you love the landscape of the American West. That your love of the mountains and just the rugged beauty of Colorado is part of your story of how you ended up there from, the other side of the world. And so being able to tap into that passion for the landscape and familiarity with it. Like I'm always, when we're talking, you're like, oh, and that's that peak and that's that peak. I'm like, okay, I'm like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but sounds good. Like that's this deep, deep, deep connoisseurship, but also lived experience and passion that you bring to your appraisal work.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It is. I mean, a total immersion in this particular landscape. I don't come to it from a ranching background, but I do come to it from I love to hike, I love to ski, I love to mountain bike, I used to like to camp. I don't really do that anymore. But just coming up from that observation standpoint of just being fully immersed in this environment. You're right. I mean, the sunset colors are different out here to the East Coast. You know, the East Coast does tend to be a little more pastel. Out here, we do tend to get bolder colors, which I think as you head towards New Mexico, they're even kind of crazier colors in the sunsets down there. And so seeing those day in, day out, and they're different every single day here, but there are some overarching things that you know it's a Western American Western sunset, and I think when you're looking at the colors chosen or the feelings that are represented in these historical as well as contemporary Western American pieces, you understand that emotional tie and what the feelings are that the artist was trying to capture when they chose to paint that landscape.
That's great. One thing that always depresses me, and I even embarrassed to admit that I forget about not having access. I forget that it exists, not having access to, is the night sky, and getting away from light pollution and stuff like that, because it's so rare, as a New Yorker, to get to see like more than one. Like, oh, there's that. I think that might be a star. That's such a nice experience too.
Yeah, and that's always been one of the pivotal, like the main subjects that artists have tried to capture is, and when Remington came out here, the thing that when he really became elevated above being just an illustrator, which I think is fine to be an illustrator, but he wanted to be known more as a painter, was that moment where he chose to represent the nights here without electricity, because that was an emotional type. Like you're saying, even now, that electricity had just become more prevalent in recent decades, where it was changing the way people perceived the night. And so he captured that nostalgic feeling through a lot of his nocturnes of the sources of light only coming from the stars or fire or candlelight. And so actually that moment where he painted, like where he switched to painting the Nocturne series, was where he really became emblematic of that period of time as a painter, and spoke to the hearts of East Coasters, probably West Coasters too. He's primarily people living in big cities like New York that were experiencing that huge change in the way they experienced night versus day. It's yeah. I mean, we do have a lot of lights out here these days, but you can still go to more remote areas and not and have uninterrupted starry nights, and yeah, so that is definitely
Right.
something that has always been a theme.
Wow. Wow. And
That's great.
one last question I have for you, it just came to mind is, so I know that appraisers all over have, varied collections they work with. If an appraiser has a collection where some American Western art happens to pop up, can they reach out to you to collaborate and bring in your expertise?
100%. I'd be happy to. It's there's a lot of specifics that over time you learn being in an area, and I'd be happy to share that skill with other appraisers who would be in need of that.
Excellent.
That's great.
Thank you. Yeah. Anything else you want to share in closing thoughts? Anything you wish we'd asked you?
I don't think so. I don't think I know any more than that.
Oh, you know tons
That's
more.
everything I know. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me. This has been really fun, you guys.
This
Good.
has
Good. Yeah.
been
Yeah.
surreal in the best way to have full circle, the other side of this.
Yeah, now I know how it feels.